Okay, continuing on about the um, era of good feelings, which I've labeled political nationalism. Why did they call it that? As I've told you, President Monroe, the fourth Virginian out of the first five presidents, had taken a sort of goodwill tour of the New England area, and much to a lot of people's surprise, he was very warmly greeted all around. Little children waving flags, all this sort of thing, and a newspaper writer sort of effervesced over in print that a new era of good feelings had dawned in America. So the term actually refers to Monroe's 8 years in office when there appeared to be a sort of time out from party politics, where the Federalist Party had just sort of come unglued. I mean, there wasn't any more reason for it to exist. They got uh, plowed under in the presidential election of 1816. Plus, the Republicans had pretty much morphed over and become Federalists anyway in terms of their policies. So, for some Federalists, you just oppose whatever they do, even if it puts you where the Republicans used to be. For others, no more reason to oppose them. Um, so I'll illustrate something here that in party politics, unlike arithmetic, 1 equals 0. What could that mean? That means political parties exist for the purpose of opposing other political parties, just as a baseball team exists for the purpose of playing games against other baseball teams. If there were no other baseball teams to play against, there would be no reason to organize a team. So when the Republicans, formerly the Democratic Republicans, when they found that there wasn't any other opposition in the field, there was nothing to hold them together either. Now, in our history in this country, whenever one party achieves just a prohibitive dominance like that, the real political ball game is not between the majority party and the minority party, because the minority party doesn't have enough players to field a team. The ball game becomes different factions of the dominant party. So either of two things will happen. But there's a third that hasn't happened yet, and that would be a dominant party using its monopoly of power to outlaw all opposition and become one party rule. We're too close to that right now. But either a new opposition party will organize from the outside, or the one dominant party will commit to political mitosis, if you follow me, and divide into a new two-party system, which is what happened in the 1820s. The Republicans are going to split, as we'll see. All right. President Monroe was reelected in 1820 without opposition. Why didn't he get all the electoral votes? Only George Washington had received all the electoral votes, and he did it twice. One of the electors saw that coming and threw away his vote, cast a vote for John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State, instead, just to keep it from being unanimous. Thank you. That preserved that distinction for George Washington, who alone deserves it. All right. So there's one more aspect of nationalism, and I call it judicial nationalism. Okay, in 1800, shortly before he left office, might have been 1801, President John Adams appointed a Virginian named John Marshall to be the Chief Justice of the United States. He was the fourth man to hold the job, and we'd only been at this for just over a dozen years. We've only had, I think, 12 more Chief Justices since. Already had 4. Now, Marshall was Thomas Jefferson's cousin. They called any relative a cousin in those days, but if you're not of Sib, I don't know what else you'd be but a cousin. They didn't get along. Anyway, John Marshall has no serious competition as the most influential, impactful, and transformative Chief Justice ever. Some of the things he did have gone on to bear some very bitter fruit, but we won't go into that. As I was thinking back when there was all the brouhaha about President Trump appointing Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court. Oh, he'll destroy the Constitution. No, no, he won't. John Marshall got there first. Some people think interpreting things based on the intention of the Constitution writers is destroying the Constitution. You'd have to be pretty sick to believe that. Trust me. Well, John Marshall was a confirmed Federalist, unlike most Virginians, and no one has ever dominated the court the way John Marshall did. He served as Chief Justice until his death in something like 1834. No one ever has served as long, certainly not as Chief Justice. And under his dominance, the court hands down a fairly steady stream of rulings which recast the federal government in the Federalist mold long after the party of Hamilton and Adams had disappeared. And so, in that sense, he goes down as arguably an activist judge by the standards of that time. And some of the main rulings happened during this time, just around the year 1820. I have thumbnailed 3 of them in the supplements. I want you to look at them. But there's John Marshall, still a confirmed nationalist when nationalism was no longer cool. He was for a little while, right around the end of the War of 1812. After that, people remained nationalists, but they're increasingly paranoid about the interests of their section, north, south, or west. So I would recommend that you follow up on that in the supplements. Okay, next thing up, sectionalism. As I said earlier, nationalism by, say, 1819 or 1820, it's in a way, figuratively speaking, having to scoot over and make room for a countertrend called sectionalism. And sectionalism was when people went in the 3 sections. Now, later they go down to 2, but for the time being, it's 3, the North, the South, and the West. Because of some events that took place, they became very, I'll use the word again, paranoid and touchy about the interests of their section relative to the other 2 sections, because it had been discovered that the sections do not all have the same interests. Sometimes their interests clash, and there's no one single thing the federal government can do in some of these issues that will help everybody the same way. It's going to help 1 or 2 sections at the expense of the others, flat out. So that sets up a almost a duel to the death political competition politically, sectionalism. Now, to reprise this, I mentioned this in the last video, I think. The states that had once been the northern colonies, plus the new states of Vermont and Maine, which we haven't got to yet, that's the North. The states that had been the southern colonies, now these are all bordering on the Atlantic Ocean except for Vermont, that's the South. And then you have a significant geographical barrier, more significant by far then than now, the Appalachian Mountains. Anything west of that is the West, okay, which will eventually fracture along north-south lines, but that's still in the future here. And the northern part of it, you got Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and eventually Michigan, Wisconsin. You've got Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, eventually Arkansas. That's the West. Okay? So, in Missouri. So those are the 3 sections. Now, there were 3 things that happened. One of them is more of a longer haul thing. We'll deal with that first. And 2 others that are more point-in-time issues that speed the emergence of sectionalism. And of course, where's sectionalism going to go? We're going to end up fighting a war with ourselves in the 1860s. It's called the Civil War. We're just starting the wheels headed that direction. Okay, the first one is the emergence of the West as a distinct section. Westerners, ironically, Westerners tended to be more nationalistic than Easterners. The original states that had been there a long time before they became part of the United States, they have these prior histories, and people tended to have a more profound umbilical connection to their original state than Westerners did. Westerners were usually people who had left one of the original states and moved to a new state. Now, sometimes that will make a person just a extremely enthusiastic partisan in favor of their new state identity. Not necessarily always, but mainly it's a matter of interest more than it is emotion. The West needed things that only the federal government can provide. It needs financing, if it can get it, for things like roads and bridges, what they call internal improvements. It would like federal assistance in getting the Indians cleared out of the way. Sounds cold, and it was. Um, and things like that. So the West has interest and somewhat increasingly a culture and an identity of its own. Now, since the West does not have the votes in Congress to get much of what it needs, members of Congress who represented Western states form what would much later be called a bloc, spelled B-L-O-C without a K. That's a sort of a generally unofficial alliance of politicians or political groups or political representatives. So the Westerners would vote together as a bloc on anything pertaining to the interests of the West. Now, they played the North and South off against each other. All right? Their populations are not enough to put them in the ball game in direct competition, but they would say vote with the South against the North on some issue the South wants in exchange for the South voting with the West on some issue the West wants. Same with the North. They would play them off against each other. Sometimes in politics, this might be called log rolling back in the day, or an eye for an eye. I would be spelled A-Y-E, voting yes. Okay, so the West emerges as a distinct section. Then there were two events or developments that were somewhat startling and led to the sectionalization of politics. In 1819, the economy just rolled off the table. The supplement will give you some of the reasons why. The reasons why are secondary to the effect. But they had a crude and primitive version of what much later might be called a depression. Times are hard all over, and of course, this is what's going to give people the idea, the notion, the realization that federal policies affect them and their pocketbook. That really hadn't been there before on the table. But Northerners, Southerners, and Westerners are all besieging their members of Congress to try to get the federal government to do something that will relieve the economic crisis in their section. And what came to light is that there was no one thing the federal government could do that would help everybody. Specific issues. The West would like to have a more lenient land policy, make it easier for people to buy land in the West, lower the minimum bid, lower the minimum purchase, all that stuff. That would speed up the westward movement, and it would stimulate Western economies. The eastern sections, North and South, say, no, 1,000 times no, because that would slow their economies down. The people picking up and leaving and moving out to Kentucky or somewhere, that's going to stagnate your economy. So what helps one hurts the other. What hurts one helps the other. There you go. Internal improvements. They want funding for that. East and West oppose that. So follow up on this, the supplements. You see that there was no one thing on any of the issues that were on the table that would help everybody. One more issue, the tariff. Okay, the North, where such industry as there was, it's just getting started, they want the tariff raised to give them more protection from foreign competition. The South and the West agree they want it lowered. So you can't compromise that. So national politics settles in for a long time, and in a way it still is, as this grim sort of do or die battle to influence federal policies favorably to your section of the country. Hence, Northerners, Southerners, and Westerners each perceive their own interests to be in conflict with those of the other sections to one degree or another that's going to sectionalize politics.